In a Maine harbor town, the rich man noticed a change the designer woman did not explain. She noticed something he never explained. The bell above the cafe door rang once, then settled back into silence. It was early enough that the harbor was still half hidden by fog, the kind that blurred edges without erasing them. Inside, the cafe held the same arrangement it always had. Narrow counter, 2 windows facing the water, a back table that caught reflections more than light. Caleb Rowan stepped in and paused, not because he was unsure, but because the room needed a second to place him. Wet boots on old wood, a dark coat shaken once, then hung carefully on the hook by the door. He did not look around. He walked straight to the back table and sat, placing his gloves beside his mug, parallel to the edge. Someone near the counter noticed the way he chose the same seat, without checking if it was free. Someone else noticed that no one had been sitting there anyway. The waitress brought coffee without asking. Black, no sugar. She set it down and moved on. Caleb wrapped his hands around the mug, but did not drink yet. Across the room, Iris Calder had been there long enough for the fog on the window to clear and return. Her coat was folded over the chair, her canvas bag resting at her feet. A sketchbook lay open in front of her, blank, pencil resting across the page as if it had been placed there and forgotten. She did not look up when Caleb entered. She noticed a shift first. The brief pause in the room, the way a conversation near the counter thinned out, then resumed in a lower register. She noticed the waitress change direction mid-step. Only then did Iris lift her eyes. She saw Caleb. She did not react. Her gaze moved to his hands, then to the mug, then back to the page in front of her. The pencil rolled slightly under her fingers. She stopped it with her thumb. Caleb did not look at her. That too was noticed. A man by the window leaned back and murmured something to the woman with him. She followed his glance, then returned to her coffee. No names were spoken. None were needed. Outside, a gull cried once, distant and thin, then disappeared into the fog. Caleb took his first sip. He drank slowly, set the mug back in the same spot, and rested his hands on either side of it. He looked past the window, toward where the water met the sky, though neither was fully visible. Iris turned a page in her sketchbook, even though there was nothing on the first one. The sound carried softly in the quiet room. She adjusted the pencil again and made a single line near the edge of the paper, then stopped. The cafe door opened and closed. Someone came in. Someone left. The bell rang and settled again. From the counter, someone noticed that Caleb Rowan had returned to the same cafe at the same hour, after being gone long enough for the absence to have faded into routine. Someone else noticed that Iris Calder had not left town, had not changed her hours, had not moved her seat. They were both there, not together, not apart enough to avoid being seen. Caleb finished his coffee and stood. He placed a bill on the table, tucked his gloves into his coat pocket, and turned toward the door. As he passed, Iris shifted her chair back slightly to give him room. Their sleeves did not touch. "Morning," he said, without stopping. "Morning," she replied. No follow-up, no recognition beyond that. The door closed behind him, and the room returned to its earlier rhythm. Iris sat for a moment longer, then closed her sketchbook and slipped it in her bag. From a window, someone noticed Caleb step out into the fog and turn toward the harbor road. Someone else noticed Iris stand, fold her coat over her arm, and walk in the opposite direction. Neither hurried. Neither looked back. What had been seen remained exactly that. Seen, unmarked by comment, unclaimed by explanation. And in the quiet space left behind, the town continued, holding the moment the way it held so many others, without deciding yet what, if anything, it meant. Morning did not announce itself in a harbor town. It arrived quietly, the way it always did, through a thinning of darkness rather than the appearance of light. The fog came first. It slid in from the water and settled low along the docks, softening the lines of boats and posts until everything looked closer than it was. The air carried the smell of salt and damp wood, cold but not sharp, heavy but not harsh. Along the shoreline, waves moved in an even rhythm. They did not crash. They did not hurry. They met the rocks and pulled back again, leaving a thin sheen of water that reflected the gray sky before fading. Caleb Rowan walked along the harbor road with his hands in his coat pockets. The pavement was wet from mist, darkened where it curved closer to the water. He followed the bend without thinking, his pace matching the town's unspoken tempo. Wooden houses lined the road, their paint weathered to muted colors that blended easily with the sky. Porches held chairs turned slightly toward the sea, as if left that way on purpose. Steps creaked when weight passed over them, but no one hurried to quiet the sound. A gull called from somewhere above the fog, distant enough to feel like part of the weather rather than a presence. Another answered farther out. Down on the dock, fishing boats rested against their lines. Nets hung to dry, stiff and dark with use. Ropes lay coiled where they had been dropped the night before. A man moved between two boats, checking knots with gloved hands, his breath visible for a moment before it disappeared. Caleb stopped near the edge of the dock and looked out. Not searching, not measuring, just standing long enough for the water to keep moving without him. Behind him, the town began to wake. A door opened near the corner shop that sold bait, coffee filters, and stamps from the same narrow counter. The owner flipped the sign to open and stepped back inside. A truck passed slowly on the road above the harbor, tires hissing against damp pavement. Across town, Iris Calder lifted the gate of her workshop. The metal rattled briefly, then steadied. Inside, bolts of fabric caught the pale winter light, their textures more visible than their colors. She did not turn on the overhead lights. The morning provided enough. She set her bag down, smoothed the length of cloth once, and moved on to the next task without pause. The fog shifted as the morning went on. It thinned near the water first, revealing the outlines of boats and the far edge of the harbor. It lingered longer along the road, clinging to fences and the low stone wall that marked the boundary between pavement and shore. Caleb continued walking. He passed the post office, its windows still dark, and the small grocery store where crates waited outside for later. He did not stop. He would come back when the day asked for it. The road curved again, away from the water, then back toward it. It did not run straight. It followed the land as it was. A light rain began to fall. Not enough to drive anyone inside, just enough to settle the dust and darken the wood of the dock. Caleb pulled his coat closer and kept going. In the café, chairs scraped softly as the first customers took their seats. Mugs were set down. A radio played low behind the counter, more habit than sound. Conversation stayed close to the table, never rising enough to claim the room. Someone noticed that Caleb had passed the window earlier and had not come in yet. Someone else noticed that Iris Calder's workshop gate was raised, then lowered again. These were not observations that required comment. At the far end of the dock, a boat eased out, engine low, leaving only a narrow line in the water that closed behind it. The harbor accepted the movement without change. Caleb paused near a bench that faced the sea. He did not sit. He rested his hand briefly on the back of it, then continued on. By mid-morning, the fog had lifted enough for the light to show its shape. Winter light in Maine did not warm things. It clarified them. It revealed the grain of wood, the unevenness of stone, the small repairs that had been made, and the ones still waiting. The town worked quietly within it. A woman swept the steps of her house. A man stacked crates near the dock. Someone opened a window and let the air in, then closed it again when the wind shifted. Caleb turned back toward town as the rain eased. His path took him past the same places in reverse order. The bench, the curve, the dock. Across the street, Iris stepped out of her workshop with a narrow box under her arm. She paused to lock the door, testing the handle once before turning away. She crossed the street without hurry, adjusting her grip as the wind pressed lightly against her coat. Caleb saw her from a distance. She did not look toward him. There, paths did not cross. From a window above the café, someone noticed both of them moving through the morning in opposite directions. It was a detail without weight. The harbor town held its shape as the day went on. Rough on the outside, wood, stone, weather. Gentle inside, space to move. Time to stand still. Nothing asked to be explained. The fog returned in thin strands as the afternoon approached. The ocean kept its pace. The road remained curved. And within it all, the town continued, not as a backdrop, but as a presence that noticed what passed through it and allowed it to pass. Unchanged, patient, and open enough to hold what came next. Caleb Rowan woke while the light was still undecided. The room held that early gray that belonged neither to night nor to morning. He lay still for a moment, listening. The ocean moved somewhere beyond the walls, steady and unhurried, its sound low enough to feel more than hear. Wind brushed along the siding, then passed on. He sat up and stood without turning on the light. The window faced the water. He opened it a few inches and let the cold air come in. It carried salt, dampness, and the faint metallic scent of boats resting against their lines. He stayed there long enough for the chill to reach his hands, then closed the window again when the wind shifted. In the kitchen, he filled the kettle halfway and set it on the stove. Coffee grounds went into the press, measured by habit rather than scale. When the water was ready, he poured it slowly, watching the surface rise and settle. He waited. He drank standing at first, then moved to the chair near the window and sat. The mug warmed his hands. Outside, the water was still mostly hidden by fog, but the movement was visible where the surface caught the light. He drank without hurry and set the mug down when it was finished. A notebook lay closed on the table. He opened it and wrote a few lines, then stopped. He sketched the curve of a shoreline, erased part of it, and left the rest unfinished. The pencil stayed where it fell. By the time he stepped outside, the road was damp and dark from mist. He walked toward the shore, his pace even, not fast enough to draw attention, not slow enough to linger. The seals were already there. They rested on a low rock just offshore, dark shapes against the gray water. One lifted its head when Caleb approached, then settled again. He stopped several yards away and watched. He did not move closer. He did not speak. He stayed until one slipped into the water, then another, until the rock was empty again. Farther out, fishing boats moved along the edge of the fog, engines low, lines cutting narrow paths through the water. A man on one boat raised a hand. Caleb raised his in return. Nothing else passed between them. He walked along the beach and picked up a length of driftwood that had been pushed higher by the last tide. It was smooth in places, rough in others. He turned it once in his hands and carried it with him. Mid-morning found him at the small repair shop near the bend in the road. He set the driftwood down outside and stepped in. "I need sandpaper," he said. The man behind the counter slid a few sheets across without asking what it was for. Caleb paid, nodded, and stepped back out. He sat on a low stool and worked the wood slowly, letting the grain guide his hands. Dust collected at his feet. People passed. Some nodded. Some did not. No one stopped. When the edge felt right, he set the wood aside and stood. He brushed his hands against his coat and picked up the piece again. His next stop was the grocery store. He chose bread, soup, apples. Nothing else. At the counter, he waited without checking the time. He thanked the clerk and stepped back outside. That was enough for the day. He returned home along the longer route, the one that curved away from the water before coming back to it. Fog rolled in low along the road, thinning as the light grew stronger. He paused once to look out at the harbor, then continued on. At home, he heated the soup and ate standing at the counter. When he finished, he rinsed the bowl and set it to dry. He sanded the driftwood again, just enough to remove a rough spot he had missed earlier, then set it on the table by the window. The afternoon passed quietly. He wrote a few more lines in the notebook, then closed it. He stepped outside again when the fog thickened and walked along the shoreline without picking anything up this time. He stood watching the water until the cold reached his hands, then went back inside and closed the window when the wind rose. As evening approached, he did not go far. He walked to the familiar diner near the edge of town and took the same seat he always did, near the window, but not directly in it. Soup arrived. Bread followed. He ate without hurry, left cash on the table, and nodded once to the woman behind the counter before leaving. The road was darker now. Street lights cast uneven circles on the pavement. Fog moved between them, softening the edges of houses and fences. Back at home, he closed the shutters against the wind and checked the latch twice. He stood for a moment near the window, listening to the ocean through the glass. The driftwood lay on the table where he had left it. He moved it slightly, aligning it with the edge, then left it there. The day ended the way it had begun, without announcement. Outside, the harbor settled into night. Boats rested against their lines. The water kept its pace. Inside, Caleb sat until the room grew cooler, then turned off the light and went to bed. The routine would repeat, not exactly, but close enough to hold its shape. The morning carried on without making space for anything new. Fog moved off the water in thin layers, not leaving all at once, just enough to reveal the dock and the road beside it. The town settled into its usual shape. Doors opened. A truck passed. Someone swept a step and stopped when the wind shifted. Caleb Rowan walked the harbor road at the same hour. He always did. His pace did not change when he reached the curve where the water came closest to the pavement. He slowed only long enough to look out, then continued on. Iris Calder was already there. She stood near the edge of the dock, not close enough to draw attention, not far enough to be separate from it. A narrow box rested on the bench beside her. She had one hand in her coat pocket, the other steadying the lid as the wind pushed lightly against it. She did not look toward the road. Caleb noticed her because she was part of the place, not because she stood out, not because she waited. She occupied the space the way the bench did, the way the post did, the way the dock itself had learned to stay where it was. He slowed. He did not stop. She glanced up then, her eyes moving across the water before shifting briefly toward him. The look lasted no longer than it needed to. She did not hold it. She did not look away quickly either, just enough to register that he was there. That was all. Caleb nodded once as he passed. Iris returned the nod, slight, almost automatic. No words followed. Neither turned. The seals were farther down the shore that morning, resting on a rock half hidden by the tide. Caleb stopped at his usual distance. Iris did not join him. She stayed where she was, lifting the lid of the box and checking its contents. Inside were folded pieces of fabric, neutral in color, stacked carefully. She adjusted one corner and closed the lid again. The latch caught softly. A gull called overhead. Another answered. From the window of the café across the road, someone noticed the way the two of them shared the morning without crossing paths. Someone else noticed that nothing was being made of it. Iris picked up the box and carried it toward the workshop at the edge of town. She walked without hurry, stopping once to let a truck pass. When it did, she continued on, the box held close but not guarded. Caleb stayed by the water a moment longer, then turned back toward town. Later that day, he saw her again at the repair shop. She stood near the counter, speaking with the man behind it. Her voice was low. The words were practical. When she finished, she stepped aside without looking around, making space for whoever came next. Caleb waited until the counter cleared, then stepped forward. As he paid, Iris reached for the door at the same time. She paused, letting him pass first. "Thanks," he said. She nodded. Of course. No follow-up. No explanation for why she had stepped back instead of forward. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly. Iris turned in the opposite direction from Caleb, then stopped. "You dropped this," she said, holding out a folded receipt. He checked his pocket, then took it from her hand. "There." Fingers did not touch. "Appreciate it." She nodded again. "Sure." She walked on. That was the detail people noticed later. Not the words. Not the exchange. Just the way she returned something without asking a question, without using it to extend the moment. In the afternoon, Iris worked with the workshop door open. The light shifted across the floor as clouds moved overhead. She cut, measured, stitched. When the wind grew stronger, she closed the door partway and went on working. Caleb passed once, then again, each time at a different distance. He did not look in. She did not look out. Toward evening, they crossed paths again near the diner. Iris held the door for an older woman, then stepped back to let her pass. Caleb followed. Iris took the table near the wall. Caleb sat closer to the window. Soup arrived. Bread followed. They ate in parallel silence, not together, not separate enough to avoid being noticed. When Iris finished, she stood and pulled on her coat. "Have a good night," she said to the room, not to anyone in particular. Caleb nodded once as she passed. She returned it and left. From the counter, someone noticed that she did not glance back. Someone else noticed that he did not watch her go. Outside, the fog returned in thin streaks as the light faded. Iris walked toward home, the streetlights catching briefly on the edges of her coat. Caleb paid and followed the harbor road in the opposite direction. The town accepted the pattern without comment. She had entered his days the way a familiar object does. Without demand, without explanation, present then not. And in that quiet, unclaimed space, the shape of things held, steady enough to continue, open enough to allow what might come next. The dock was busier than it had been earlier in the week, though nothing about it felt rushed. Crates were stacked near the edge. Nets lay open, drying where the wind could reach them. The tide moved in its steady pattern, lifting and lowering the boats without changing their distance from shore. Caleb Rowan stood near the end of the dock with a small coil of rope in his hands. He was not tying anything down. He was straightening what had already been tied, pulling slack through and laying it flat where it would not catch a boot later. A few feet away, Iris Calder stepped around a bucket and paused. She waited, not because she had to, but because the space was narrow and he was finishing what he was doing. Caleb noticed her shadow first, then her shoes. He shifted half a step to the side. "Go ahead," he said. "Thanks," she replied. That was the first time they spoke directly. She passed without brushing against him and set the bucket down near the bench. Inside were small tools, a cloth folded over the top. She knelt and wiped her hands on her coat, then stood again. The wind lifted briefly, tugging at the edge of the cloth. Iris caught it before it slipped. Caleb finished with the rope and set it back where it belonged. He did not look for anything else to fix. "You need that moved?" he asked, nodding toward the crate near her foot. "No," she said. "It is fine there." He nodded once and stepped back. They worked in the same area without sharing the task. Iris checked the latch on the bench, tightened a screw that had worked loose. Caleb lifted an empty crate and carried it a few yards down the dock, setting it beside the others. Neither spoke again until the sound of a boat engine grew louder, approaching from the far end of the harbor. Iris glanced toward the water. "They are early." Caleb followed her look. "Wind is shifting." She nodded. "Makes sense." The boat eased in, bumping softly against the dock. A man jumped down and tied the line. He looked from Iris to Caleb and back again, then went back to his work without comment. Someone farther up the dock noticed the three of them standing close enough to share the same space, but not the same conversation. Iris picked up her bucket. "I'm heading back," she said. "All right," Caleb replied. She hesitated, then reached into the bucket and lifted out a small folded cloth. "This fell earlier," she said, holding it out. "From your pocket." He checked, then took it. "I wondered where that went." She smiled briefly. Not at him, but at the exchange itself. "Happens." Their hands did not touch. She turned to leave, then paused. "There's a loose board near the bend," she said. "Closer to the water." "I will take a look," he said. "That is all." She walked away, her steps steady on the damp wood. Caleb stayed where he was for a moment longer, then followed the line of the dock toward the bend she had mentioned. He found the board and pressed it down with his boot. It shifted slightly. He noted it and moved on. Later, at the café, they crossed paths again. Iris stood at the counter with a mug in her hands. Caleb waited behind her. When she stepped aside, she held the door for him without comment. "Appreciate it," he said. She nodded. "Sure." They took different tables. Soup arrived. The room filled and emptied around them. From the window, someone noticed that they had spoken twice and nothing had been made of it. Someone else noticed that neither had lingered. When Iris finished, she stood and pulled on her coat. "Have a good one," she said, not aiming the words at anyone in particular. Caleb raised his mug slightly. "You too." She left. The bell rang. The door closed. What remained was not a beginning or an ending, just a sequence of ordinary exchanges, placed carefully, then left where they were. The dock stayed steady under the tide. The café returned to its usual rhythm, and in the middle of it, the town carried on, having seen enough to remember and not enough to interrupt. The change did not announce itself. It arrived the way small shifts often do in the harbor town, without sound, without agreement, without anyone deciding it should matter. The morning had begun like the others. Fog low over the water. Nets hung to dry. The road darkened by mist. People moved through it on paths, already worn in a habit. Caleb Rowan stepped onto the dock just after sunrise. He did not carry tools. He did not bring a plan. He walked to the far end where the planks dipped slightly, where the tide pressed up from below and left a thin line of wetness along the wood. A loose board sat there. It had been loose for a while. Not enough to break, just enough to shift when weight passed over it. People stepped around it. Caleb knelt and pressed his hand against the plank. It moved. He looked along the dock, then stood and walked back toward shore. He found a crate, turned it on its side, and used it to prop the board long. Enough to pull it flush again. He did not secure it. He did not mark it. He pressed it down until it held. Then he stood and stepped away. The work was small. No one had asked for it. No one was waiting for it to be done. A man tying a boat line watched from a few yards away. He paused, then went back to his knot. From the café window across the road, someone noticed Caleb kneel and stand again, then continue walking as if nothing had happened. That was the first shift. Later that morning, a gust of wind moved down the dock, stronger than the ones before it. A crate near the edge tipped and slid. It did not fall into the water. It stopped against the bench where Iris Calder usually set her box. She reached it at the same time Caleb did. He caught the crate with one hand and steadied it. She took the other side without looking at him. "Thanks," she said, once it was upright again. He nodded. "No problem." She adjusted the bench back into place. He stepped away. There was no pause afterward. No lingering. The moment closed as soon as it had opened. Someone farther down the dock noticed that neither of them said anything else. By midday, the tide had turned. Boats came in earlier than expected, nudged along by the wind. The dock grew more crowded. People moved closer together, adjusting without comment. Caleb walked through it, shifting an empty crate out of the main path, setting a loose rope aside so it would not catch a heel. He did not stay with any task long enough for it to become visible as help. No one thanked him. No one told him to stop. The town did not react the way it usually did when someone did more than was required. That was the second shift. At the repair shop, Iris stood at the counter, listening while the man behind it explained a delay. Caleb waited a few feet back. When she finished and stepped aside, he moved forward without looking at her. Outside, Iris adjusted the strap on her bag. Caleb exited behind her. They paused at the same time to let a truck pass. She spoke first. "That board by the bend," she said. "It does not move anymore." He glanced toward the dock. "All right." She nodded. "Good. That was it. No question of when. No mention of how." She turned toward her workshop. He turned toward the harbor road. From the grocery store doorway, someone noticed that the exchange had ended before it could become anything else. In the afternoon, rain moved in, light but persistent. It darkened the wood and flattened the dust. The dock took on a different sound underfoot. A delivery arrived late. Boxes stacked near the edge, closer to the water than usual. The man unloading them wiped his hands on his jacket and stepped back. Caleb approached, shifted 2 boxes a few inches farther from the edge, then walked on. The man noticed. He did not say anything. Later, when the rain eased, Iris crossed the dock with a narrow bundle under her arm. She stepped where the board had been loose and did not slow down. She did not look back. That was the third shift. By early evening, the diner filled with its usual mix of voices and steam. Caleb took his seat near the window. Iris arrived later and sat at the counter. Soup was served. Bread followed. The room held both of them without arranging them together. When Iris stood to leave, she paused near the door, waiting for someone else to pass. Caleb finished his soup and stood at the same moment. They reached the door together. She stepped back. "Go ahead," she said. "Thanks," he replied. He held the door as she passed. She nodded once and went out. "No es mal. No delay." From behind the counter, someone noticed that the exchange was practical and complete. Outside, the wind had settled. Fog crept back along the road in thin layers. Iris walked toward her workshop. Caleb turned toward the harbor. Neither looked over his shoulder. Later that night, the loose board held when a man crossed it carrying gear. He did not notice the difference, only that the dock felt steady. The crate near the bench stayed where it was. The rope did not catch. The town absorbed these changes without assigning them weight. No one spoke about Caleb Rowan doing things that did not need to be done. No one decided what it meant. Iris did not mention it again. That was the final shift of the day. Not a transformation. Not a turning point that announced itself. Just a quiet rearrangement of expectation. The town did not respond with praise. It did not respond with resistance. It did not move closer or farther away. It simply allowed the adjustments to remain. And in that allowance, something subtle took hold. Not recognition, not connection, just a new way of standing in the same space, where actions could exist without explanation, and where being seen did not require being answered. The harbor held its line against the tide. The road curved as it always had, and the day closed with everything in place, slightly different than before, and no one asking why. The dock did not change its shape after the small adjustments. What changed was how people moved through it. Caleb Rowan noticed it first in the spacing. A half step held longer. A glance did not complete itself. Conversations thinned when he entered a room, not out of caution, but out of habit adjusting. The town did not lean toward him. It did not lean away. It recalibrated. That was where the tension lived. Not in words, not in action, in distance. He crossed the dock mid-morning, the tide pulling low against the posts. A fisherman paused as Caleb passed, hands resting on a coil of rope. Their eyes met briefly, then moved on. The pause was longer than before, not enough to demand explanation. Across the road, Iris Calder stepped out of her workshop to shake a piece of fabric free of lint. She did not look toward the dock right away. She finished what she was doing, folded the fabric once, then glanced up. She saw Caleb. She did not change direction. The space between them remained intact. Neither closed it, neither expanded it. A gull cried overhead. Wind pushed lightly against the doorframe. Iris held the fabric steady until the gust passed, then went back inside. From the cafe window, someone noticed that Caleb slowed slightly when he reached the bend in the road, then resumed his pace. Someone else noticed that Iris had left her door open longer than usual before closing it again. Nothing followed those observations. At the grocery store, Caleb waited his turn at the counter. Iris stood 2 places ahead of him. When the clerk finished ringing her items, Iris stepped aside without looking back. The space she left was deliberate, not inviting, not closed. Caleb stepped forward. Paper or plastic? The clerk asked. Paper, he said. Iris waited near the door, adjusting the strap of her bag. When Caleb finished, she opened the door and held it. He passed through. Thanks, he said. She nodded. Sure. The door closed behind them. They walked in opposite directions. The tension did not follow either of them. It stayed where they had been, lingering briefly in the empty space before dispersing. Later, near the harbor, fog rolled in low and slow. Visibility shortened. Sound carried differently. Footsteps arrived before the people making them. Caleb stood near the water, hands in his coat pockets, watching the tide pull back from the rocks. Iris approached from the other end of the path. She did not see him until she was close enough that stopping would have been noticeable. She slowed. He shifted slightly to one side. They passed each other at arm's length. Their eyes met. Just once. Not a question. Not a challenge. Just acknowledgement. Then they were past each other, the fog closing the space behind them as if it had never opened. Someone on a bench farther up the path watched the exchange. They noticed the way neither of them looked back. They noticed how long the moment took, though nothing appeared to happen inside it. The bench creaked as the person shifted their weight. They exhaled and settled again. In the afternoon, the repair shop door stayed open. Iris worked at the back table, her movement steady, measured. Caleb passed by twice. The second time, she glanced up as he went by. He noticed. He did not alter his pace. The distance held. At the diner that evening, the room filled with the sound of cutlery and low conversation. Caleb took his usual seat near the window. Iris arrived later and sat at the counter. Steam rose from bowls. Bread was passed. Chairs scraped softly. Caleb looked up once and saw Iris watching the reflection in the window rather than the room itself. The reflection held his outline briefly, then shifted as someone moved between them. She did not turn. He did not keep looking. The tension did not sharpen. It did not resolve. It stayed suspended like breath held without strain. From behind the counter, someone noticed that the two of them occupied the same room differently now. Not closer, not farther apart, just aware. When Iris finished, she stood and pulled on her coat. She paused, then stepped back to let someone else pass. Caleb finished moments later and stood at the same time. They reached the door together. She stopped. "You go ahead," she said. He did not argue. He opened the door and stepped outside. She followed, a few steps behind. The night air was damp and cool. Fog softened the street lights in pale halos. They stood for a moment under the awning, neither moving until the rain thinned. Someone walking past slowed unconsciously, then continued on, their breath visible in the cold. Caleb nodded once. Iris returned it. That was all. They separated, each taking a familiar route. The tension did not break. It did not escalate. It settled into the rhythm of the town, becoming part of the background, like the sound of water against wood, noticeable only when attention rested on it. The harbor breathed in, then out. A pause followed, unmarked, unclaimed, long enough for anyone watching to feel their own breathing slow before the moment moved on, leaving nothing behind that needed to be named. The morning opened with clearer air. The fog had thinned overnight, leaving the harbor visible from end to end. Boats rested in place, their lines slack. The water moved without sound that carried far. The town adjusted to the change without comment. Caleb Rowan walked the road along the shore, hands in his coat pockets, his pace steady. At the bend where the path split, he slowed, then continued straight. He did not look behind him. A few minutes later, Iris Calder came down the same road from the opposite direction. She carried nothing with her this time. Her coat was buttoned to the collar. She walked with the same measured rhythm she always kept, not trying to catch up, not avoiding the possibility. They met where the road widened near the dock. Neither stopped at first. Then both did, almost at the same moment, as if the pause belonged to the place rather than to them. "Morning," Caleb said. "Morning," Iris replied. They stood with the harbor between them and the town behind them. Space remained. It did not close on its own. "I'm heading down this way," she said, nodding toward the dock. "All right," he said. "I was going to check the path by the water." She waited a beat, long enough for the choice to exist. "I can walk part of it," she said. "Sure." They turned and began moving in the same direction, not shoulder to shoulder, but close enough to share the sound of their steps. Neither adjusted their pace to match the other. It happened without effort. They walked past the first stretch of dock in silence. A man unloading supplies glanced up, then went back to his work. The seals rested farther out, barely lifting their heads as the two figures passed. At the place where the path narrowed again, Iris slowed. "This is where I turn back," she said. "Okay," Caleb replied. They stopped. The boundary was clear. Neither tried to cross it. She shifted her weight and looked out at the water, then back toward him. "You do not have to answer yet," she said, lightly, as if the words were meant for the space rather than for him. He nodded once. Understood. She turned away first, heading back toward town. He watched her go only long enough to be sure she had cleared the narrow path, then continued on toward the water. From the dock, someone noticed that they had walked together for a short distance and then separated without hesitation. Someone else noticed that neither looked unsettled by it. Later that day, they crossed paths again near the grocery store. Iris stood outside, reading a notice posted on the window. Caleb approached, slowed, and stopped a few steps away. "Anything useful?" he asked. "Nothing urgent," she said. "Delivery delay." "All right." She stepped aside to let him pass. He went in. She stayed where she was. When he came back out, she was already walking away. That was the shape the day took. In the afternoon, rain moved in briefly, then passed. The streets darkened and lightened again. Doors opened and closed. The town carried on. Caleb returned to the harbor near evening. He stood by the water longer than usual, watching the tide pull back. Iris did not appear. At the diner, they arrived within minutes of each other. Iris took the counter. Caleb took the window table. Soup arrived. Bread followed. They ate without looking at one another. When Iris finished, she stood and pulled on her coat. She paused near the door, then glanced back once. "I will see you around," she said. Caleb looked up. "Sure." She left. From behind the counter, someone noticed that the exchange sounded like a closing and an opening at the same time. Outside, the air cooled quickly. The harbor lights flickered on, one by one. The water reflected them, stretching each point into a thin line before letting it break apart again. Caleb finished his meal and paid. He stepped out into the evening and turned toward home. The boundary held, not as distance, but as clarity, a shared understanding of where to stop and when to continue separately. The town accepted it as it accepted most things, without comment, without pressure, and in that quiet allowance, the small trust settled where it belonged, unforced, untested, present enough to remain, without requiring anything more just yet. The movement that entered the town that week did not arrive as urgency. It came as interruption. The wind shifted early one afternoon, sharper than it had been, pushing low waves farther up the rocks than usual. The harbor adjusted without alarm. Boats creaked against their lines. The dock dipped and rose in a slower rhythm. Caleb Rowan walked the shoreline path with his hands in his pockets, eyes following the water where it met the stone. He noticed a change in sound before anything else. The water struck the rocks at a slightly different angle, a hollow note where there had been a flatter one the day before. Farther down the path, Iris Calder stood near the bend where the ground narrowed. She was not close to the edge. She had stopped to retie one bootlace. Her foot braced against a rock that had been there longer than the path itself. A gust pushed against her coat. She straightened, adjusted the collar, and finished tying the lace. Caleb slowed as he approached. He did not call out. He did not change course. A wave rolled higher than the others and broke closer to shore. Water spread across the rocks and receded just as quickly, leaving the stone darker, slicker. Iris stepped back without hurry. Caleb watched, ready to move if the water pushed farther than it had. It did not. The moment passed without requiring anything from either of them. They continued in opposite directions, the path widening again as if nothing had happened. From a bench above the rocks, someone noticed the pause. Someone else noticed that it ended on its own. That was the first motion. Later, near the repair shop, a delivery truck pulled up at an angle that made unloading awkward. Boxes were stacked too close to the edge of the sidewalk, forcing people to step around them one at a time. Caleb approached as a man struggled to adjust a crate that had been set down crooked. Before the man could ask, Caleb shifted the crate a few inches, just enough to straighten the line. "Got it," the man said, already reaching for the next box. Caleb stepped back and continued on. No one thanked him. No one mentioned it again. Iris arrived a few minutes later and saw the boxes already aligned. She adjusted her route without comment and went inside the shop. That was the second motion. The town absorbed both without pause. In the café, a chair leg caught briefly on the uneven floor as someone stood. The sound drew a glance from the counter. Caleb reached down, nudged the leg into place with his foot, and sat back. Across the room, Iris watched the steam rise from her mug and dissipate against the window. She noticed the adjustment only because the sound stopped. She did not look up. When she left, she held the door for the person behind her, then stepped out into the street without waiting for acknowledgement. From inside, someone noticed the door closing more gently than usual. In the afternoon, rain returned. Not enough to change plans. Enough to alter timing. Caleb crossed the dock as a light drizzle began, the boards darkening underfoot. A coil of rope near the edge loosened and slid slightly as the dock dipped. He reached it at the same time as Iris did. She stopped short, letting him step past. "I have it," he said. "All right," she replied. He reset the coil and stepped away. She passed, careful with her footing. They did not speak again. The rain fell for a few minutes more, then eased. The dock dried unevenly, leaving darker shapes where the water had lingered. That was the third motion. Near evening, a child ran ahead of their parent along the harbor road, boots splashing through shallow puddles. The child stumbled when one foot caught the edge of the pavement. The child did not fall. They recovered their balance and kept running, laughing, unaware of how close they had come to needing help. Caleb slowed, then continued. Iris, walking a few steps behind, adjusted her pace and moved on. The parent called after the child, reminding them to slow down. No one stopped. From a window above the grocery store, someone noticed that several people had been close enough to intervene and that none of them had needed to. That was the fourth motion. At the diner that night, the room felt fuller than usual. Not crowded, just occupied. Caleb took his usual seat. Iris took the counter. A man at the end of the bar reached for the salt and knocked it over. The shaker rolled and stopped near Caleb's foot. He picked it up and set it back within reach of the man without comment. "Thanks," the man said, already turning back to his plate. Iris glanced over, then returned her attention to her bowl. When she stood to leave, she hesitated as someone behind her reached for the door at the same time. She stepped back and let them pass. "No rush," she said. They nodded and went through. Outside, the wind had settled. The harbor lights reflected in long lines across the water, broken occasionally by the movement of a boat easing in late. Caleb left a few minutes after Iris. They exited through different doors and took different streets. Neither looked for the other. The day held its shape through these moments, each one small enough to go unmarked, each one adding a slight variation to the rhythm. No one spoke about what almost happened. No one spoke about what had happened, either. The town did not elevate the gestures. It did not connect them into a pattern that needed naming. They remained what they were. Small courtesies, near movements, interruptions that resolved themselves. By the end of the week, the dock felt steadier underfoot, though nothing had been officially fixed. The path near the rocks remained the same width, though people stepped with slightly more care. Caleb continued his routine without expanding it. Iris continued hers without drawing attention to the points where it brushed against his. From time to time, someone noticed the way the town seemed to respond before help was needed, and then returned to itself when it was not. The motion stayed light. It did not pull anyone closer. It did not push anyone away. It simply passed through, leaving behind a sense that the town knew how to carry itself, and that those moving within it were learning, quietly, to do the same. The consequence arrived quietly, the way most things did in the harbor town. It began with a detail small enough to be missed. Caleb Rowan crossed the dock late morning, the tide low and the boards dry. Near the bend, a coil of rope rested closer to the edge than usual. He stopped, shifted it a few inches back, and continued on without looking around to see who might have noticed. Someone did. Not him. Not Iris. A man loading gear farther down the dock glanced up, saw the rope repositioned, and assumed it had been done for a reason. Later, when he spoke to the woman at the bait shop, he mentioned it in passing. "Someone moved that rope again," he said. "Guess they want that side clear." The woman nodded. "Makes sense." That was all. The detail repeated itself once. In the afternoon, Iris Calder approached the same stretch of dock with a narrow box under her arm. She noticed the rope's new position and adjusted her path slightly. It did not slow her down. It did not concern her. At the repair shop, she set the box down and opened it. Inside, the folded fabric was still a line from the morning. She worked for a while, then stepped outside to shake loose the thread clinging to her sleeve. Caleb passed at a distance, heading toward the harbor road. She watched him for a moment, then turned back inside. Later that day, the diner filled earlier than usual. A few extra tables were taken. Conversation stayed low. Plates clinked softly. Caleb took his usual seat by the window. Iris sat at the counter. Between them, a man and his wife discussed the weather and the incoming tide. "He keeps fixing things," the man said, not lowering his voice, not raising it either. "That fellow, always moving something." His wife shrugged. "Probably just how he is." Iris did not turn. Caleb did not react. The sentence passed through the room without settling anywhere specific. That evening, the wind picked up again, pressing harder against the dock. A crate tipped and slid closer to the edge before stopping against a post. No one moved it. People stepped around. Caleb arrived a few minutes later and paused. He looked at the crate, then at the space around it. He stepped back and walked on. Iris noticed from farther down the dock. She slowed, then continued, choosing her footing carefully. The crate stayed where it was. That was the consequence. Not a problem, not a conflict, just a shift in expectation. The town had begun to assume something that was no longer certain. The next morning, the rope remained where it had been moved. The crate stayed near the post. People adjusted their paths without comment. Caleb walked the harbor road and noticed the changes. He did not undo them. He did not correct anything. At the café, Iris stood near the window, waiting for her coffee. Caleb entered and paused briefly at the door. Their eyes met through the reflection in the glass. She nodded once. He returned it. Nothing else followed. Outside, fog thinned as the day warmed. The road curved as it always had. The water kept its pace. Near the grocery store, Iris read a notice posted on the window. Caleb approached and stopped a few steps away. "They moved the delivery again," she said, tapping the paper lightly. "Seems like it," he replied. She stepped aside to let him pass. As he went by, she added, "You do not have to keep doing that, you know." He stopped. He turned just enough to face her, not close enough to crowd the space. "I know," he said. That was it. No explanation of what she meant. No clarification of what he had been doing or not doing. She nodded, satisfied that the boundary had been named, then turned back to the notice. From inside the store, someone noticed the pause and the way it ended cleanly. In the afternoon, rain returned briefly. The dock darkened again. The crate stayed in place. No one moved it. Caleb walked past without stopping. Iris crossed later and stepped around it, her pace unchanged. By evening, the diner returned to its usual rhythm. Caleb ate at the window. Iris ate at the counter. They did not speak. When Iris stood to leave, she paused near his table. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he replied. She left. The small consequence remained, not as tension, not as distance, but as a slight recalibration of where responsibility began and ended. The town adjusted without naming it. Caleb returned home along the longer route, the one that curved away from the water before coming back to it. Iris walked toward her workshop, locking the door behind her. The rope stayed where it was. The crate remained near the post. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had escalated. But something had shifted enough to be felt lightly, like a change in wind direction that did not require comment, only awareness. The harbor accepted it. So did the town. The realization did not arrive as a thought. It came as an adjustment in how Caleb Rowan stood inside the day. He noticed it first in the morning, when he reached the dock and did not step toward the rope or the crate. He stopped where the boards were dry, hands in his coat pockets, and let the space remain as it was. The tide moved out. The water drew a thin line along the posts and pulled back again. Nothing asked for correction. A man crossed the dock carrying gear. He slowed near the crate, stepped around it, and continued on. He did not look back. The dock held. Caleb turned away and walked the longer route along the harbor road, following the curve that took him out of view of the water before returning him to it again. The road felt the same underfoot. Wet in places, uneven where it always had been. What had shifted was not the town. It was the expectation that he might be part of its balance. At the grocery store, he waited his turn at the counter. The clerk rang up his items and slid the bag across. "That is all?" she asked. "That is all," he said. He took the bag and stepped aside without checking the space behind him. Someone else moved forward. The line continued. Outside, Iris Calder stood near the window, reading a notice posted there. She did not turn when Caleb came out. She folded the paper back into place and stepped away from the glass. They walked a few steps in the same direction, then slowed at the corner where the street divided. She stopped first. "This is me," she said, nodding toward her workshop. "All right," he replied. She hesitated, then added, "You seem to have found your rhythm here." He did not answer right away. He looked down the road, then back toward the harbor. "I am part of it," he said. She nodded once. "That is different." There was no follow-up, no agreement to confirm. She turned toward her door. He continued on. From across the street, someone noticed the exchange and the way it ended without any effort to extend it. In the afternoon, the wind shifted again. Clouds moved faster. Light broke and reformed across the water. Caleb walked the path along the rocks and did not slow when he reached the place where Iris had retied her boot days earlier. The stone was dry now. Farther along, a man struggled briefly with a loose net. He adjusted it himself and moved on. Caleb watched for a moment, then turned away. The realization settled there. Not that he was unnecessary, not that he was unwanted, that his presence did not need to solve anything to belong. At the repair shop, Iris worked with the door open. The sound of her sewing machine carried briefly into the street, then stopped. She stepped outside to shake loose the thread clinging to her sleeve. Caleb passed without slowing. She glanced up and saw him, then returned to her work. From the cafe window, someone noticed that they no longer tracked each other's movements, and that this did not read as distance. In the evening, the diner filled slowly. Caleb took his usual seat by the window. Iris arrived later and sat at the counter. Steam rose from bowls. Bread was set down and passed along. The room held its shape. When Iris finished, she stood and pulled on her coat. She paused near the counter, then turned toward Caleb's table. "I am closing early tomorrow," she said. "Weather looks rough." He nodded. "Good idea." That was all. She left. Caleb stayed a while longer, watching the reflection of the harbor lights stretch and break across the water outside the window. When he stood to go, he did not look toward the counter. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the street. Fog gathered low and moved between the buildings. He pulled his coat closer and walked home. The next day, the town adjusted again. The crate by the dock was gone, moved by someone else, at some point when no one had been watching. The rope had been coiled tighter, its end tucked away. The path near the rocks remained the same width, though people stepped with the same care they had learned. Caleb noticed and did not ask when it had happened. At the cafe, he took a seat. Iris did not appear. The chair across from him remained empty. From the counter, someone noticed the absence and did not comment. In the afternoon, rain moved in heavier than before. The harbor darkened. Boats tugged at their lines. Caleb stood under the awning near the diner and waited for the rain to thin. Iris passed on the opposite side of the street, her hood pulled up, hands tucked into her pockets. She saw him and raised her chin slightly in acknowledgement. He returned the gesture. They did not cross. The realization did not change his routine. He still walked the harbor road. He still drank his coffee slowly. He still wrote a few lines and left them unfinished. What changed was the way he left space untouched. When something shifted, he noticed. When it did not, he let it be. The town responded in kind. From time to time, someone would glance toward him when something needed doing, then turn away and handle it themselves. Other times, someone else would step in before the thought could form. Caleb remained visible. He remained present, not as an answer, not as a solution, as part of the pattern. One evening, near the end of the week, he stood at the edge of the dock and watched the water pull back from the posts. Iris joined him at a distance, leaning against the railing a few yards away. They did not speak. The harbor breathed in, then out. From a bench nearby, someone watched the two figures standing apart and felt the ease of it. The way neither seemed to wait for the other to act. The way the space between them did not ask to be closed. When Iris turned to leave, she did not look back. Caleb stayed a moment longer, then followed his usual route home. The town held. It held the routine, the space, the adjustments that did not need to be named. And in that holding, something opened quietly. Not a promise, not a direction, an understanding that presence could exist without pressure, and that being seen did not require a response. Those who noticed carried that with them, lightly, as the evening settled and the harbor returned to its steady, unremarkable rhythm. Morning returned the same way it always had. Gray first, then lighter gray, then the slow appearance of edges where the fog thinned and the harbor came back into view. The water moved at its usual pace. The road along the shore curved without interruption. Caleb Rowan woke before the lights settled and followed the sequence he knew by memory. Window opened a few inches. Air drawn in. Window closed when the wind shifted. Coffee prepared without haste. The mug held between his hands until the warmth faded. Nothing about the routine was new. What had changed was where his attention rested. He did not look for the loose board when he walked the dock. He did not scan for crates near the edge. His steps stayed where they were, even unadjusted. The dock felt steady beneath him without needing to be tested. He walked past the bench where he had stopped so often before and continued on, letting the water remain background rather than reference. Seals rested farther out, lifting their heads once before settling again. He watched briefly, then moved on. The grocery store came next, earlier than usual. He bought the same items, but the order shifted. Bread first, then soup, apples last. At the counter, he waited without filling the pause. The clerk slid the bag across. He nodded and stepped aside. Outside, the harbor road was quieter than it had been the day before. A truck passed. A door opened and closed. Someone swept a step and left the broom leaning where it landed. Caleb continued on, choosing the longer route back toward the water. He did not stop at the bend. He walked through it. At the repair shop, the door stood open. Iris Calder worked inside, her back turned, the sound of fabric moving under her hands steady and unbroken. Caleb passed without slowing. She did not look up. From the cafe window across the street, someone noticed the passing and did not assign it meaning. Later, the diner filled and emptied in its usual pattern. Caleb took his seat by the window, not because it was his, but because it was open. Soup arrived. Bread followed. He ate and left cash on the table. When he stood, he did not check the counter. Outside, the afternoon light flattened the colors of the harbor, turning wood and water into muted versions of themselves. Fog lingered at the edges without committing to return. Caleb walked home and found the driftwood still on the table where he had left it days earlier. He moved it slightly, not to align it, just to clear space for the notebook beside it. He wrote a few lines and stopped. The pencil rested where it fell. In the evening, Iris closed her workshop at the same hour she always did. She tested the lock once and turned away. Her route took her past the diner and down a side street. She did not look toward the harbor. They did not cross paths. The routine held, not because it resisted change, but because it no longer carried the weight of anticipation. Caleb walked the shoreline again as the light faded. The tide moved out. Boats tugged gently at their lines. The dock creaked where it always had. He stood for a moment, then left. Behind him, the town continued to adjust itself. Someone moved a crate. Someone else left it where it was. A rope was coiled tighter. Another stayed loose. None of it required his attention. By the time night settled in, the harbor lights reflected across the water in thin lines that stretched and broke apart again. The road remained curved. The houses remained where they were. Caleb closed his shutters against the wind and sat until the room cooled. Then he turned off the light and went to bed. Elsewhere in town, Iris set a piece of fabric aside for the morning and washed her hands. She left the light on a little longer than usual, then switched it off and went upstairs. Same places, different order. No milestone marked the shift. No moment stood out enough to name. Maine stayed quiet. The town stayed present. And within that steadiness, the routines continued, unchanged in form, altered in meaning, carrying forward not as habits to hold on to, but as paths that no longer needed watching to remain clear. The town remained. It did not hold still, but it did not move away either. Morning followed night. Fog arrived and lifted in thin layers. The harbor kept its pace, water pressing in and pulling back with the same patience it had always known. Caleb Rowan walked the shoreline at an hour that no longer felt chosen. It simply arrived. He paused where the path widened, then continued on, leaving no mark that stayed longer than his. Steps. The dock creaked under weight and released it again. Boats rested. Lines held. Across town, Iris Calder opened her workshop and closed it later, the hinge sounding the same each time. Fabric caught the light, then lost it. Hands worked. Hands rested. Nothing asked to be explained. They saw each other sometimes. At a distance. In passing. In reflections that did not require turning around. Other times they did not cross at all. The days allowed for both. The café remained where it was, windows facing the water. Chairs scraped softly. Mugs warmed hands and cooled again. A seat by the window stayed empty until it was not. No one claimed it for long. The dock held the weight of crates and released it. The rope stayed coiled. The path near the rocks kept its narrow shape. People stepped with the care they had learned and forgot the reason why. What had formed did not announce itself as change. It showed up as ease, as the absence of correction, as the knowledge of where to stop and when to continue. There were ways of belonging that did not ask for explanation, ways of being seen that did not require response, ways of offering presence without pressing it forward. The town carried these quietly, the way it carried weather and tide, and the small adjustments made without instruction. It did not keep a record. It did not ask for agreement. Caleb turned home as the light faded, following the road that curved away and returned again. Iris locked her door and walked a side street where the lamps came on one by one. Their paths did not cross that evening. The harbor lights stretched across the water and broke apart. The fog waited at the edges, undecided. Nothing ended. Nothing began. The town stayed open, steady enough to hold another morning, another return, another quiet noticing that did not need to be named. And for those who moved within it, there was room to remain, to leave, or simply to stay a little longer, just as they were, without being asked to decide anything yet.